What if your wedding night became your final stand between life and death? Close your eyes for a moment. Think about the most terrifying decision you've ever had to make. Now multiply that fear by 1,000, add the weight of family honor crushing down on your shoulders, and throw in the horrifying realization that the person sleeping next to you has already murdered before, and you're next. Have you ever felt completely trapped with no way out? Have you ever discovered something so shocking about someone you trusted that it changed everything in an instant? Do you know someone who has been silenced by family expectations, forced into situations they never wanted? Tonight, I'm taking you deep into rural Pakistan, where wedding celebrations turned into a nightmare that would shake an entire nation. This isn't just another crime story. This is about what happens when desperation meets rage, when tradition collides with survival, and when a 19-year-old bride discovers her husband's darkest secrets on what should have been the most beautiful night of her life. But here's what makes this case truly chilling: the evidence that destroyed everything wasn't hidden away in some locked drawer or buried in a backyard. No, the proof of murder was sitting right there in his pocket, waiting to be found. And when Nazia Bibi unfolded that blood-stained document, she realized she had two choices: become his next victim or fight back with everything she had. What happened next would leave a groom decapitated on his wedding bed and spark a national debate that continues today. Before we dive into this shocking tale, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because stories like this one will make you question everything you think you know about justice, survival, and how far someone will go when pushed to their breaking point. Now, let me tell you about the night that turned a bride into a killer. Nazia Bibi's story begins not with violence, but with dreams that would never come true. Growing up in a small farming village outside Multan, Pakistan, 19-year-old Nazia spent her evenings writing letters she could never send. Hidden between the pages of her schoolbooks, these letters spoke of her deepest desire: to become a teacher in Multan city. She would write about the children she wanted to inspire, the classroom she longed to call her own, the independence she craved. But dreams are luxuries that poor farming families can't afford. When Nazia was 8 years old, her father died in a devastating tractor accident that left the family drowning in debt. Her mother, overwhelmed and barely surviving, relied heavily on Nazia's uncle to make all the important decisions. And in rural Pakistan, there's no decision more important than who a young woman will marry. Khalid Masood was 32 when he approached Nazia's family as a suitor. On paper, he looked perfect. A prosperous textile merchant with solid connections and enough wealth to lift Nazia's struggling family out of poverty. The marriage wouldn't just provide financial security, it would give Khalid control over her family's land through carefully structured marriage arrangements. But success often comes with shadows, and Khalid's shadow was darker than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The villagers whispered, the way villagers always do. They spoke of Khalid's violent temper, his treatment of servants who crossed him, and most disturbing of all, his first marriage. That union had lasted barely a year before his wife mysteriously disappeared near the Ravi River. Official reports claimed she had drowned accidentally, but the whispers told a different story. When Nazia heard these rumors, she tried to speak up. She approached her uncle with trembling hands and a voice barely above a whisper, begging him to reconsider. She told him about the stories, about her dreams of teaching, about the fear that gnawed at her stomach every time Khalid visited their home. Her uncle's response was swift and final: these are jealous people spreading lies about a successful man. You should be grateful that someone of his status wants you. In the rigid structure of patriarchal rural life, Nazia's voice carried no weight against financial necessity and social pressure. Her mother, though sympathetic to her daughter's fears, was terrified of returning to the crushing poverty they'd barely escaped after her husband's death. By the summer of 2017, the engagement was sealed with all the ceremony and celebration that such arrangements demand. Khalid presented expensive gifts, gold jewelry for Nazia, cash payments for her family, and promises of a prosperous future. The wedding date was set, elaborate preparations began, and Nazia's fate was locked in place like a prison cell. During the engagement period, Khalid's behavior toward Nazia was cold but not overtly threatening. He treated her more like property he had purchased than a person he planned to spend his life with. Their conversations were brief and formal, always chaperoned, always focused on practical arrangements rather than getting to know each other. But sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, Nazia caught glimpses of something that made her blood run cold. The way his eyes would flash with anger when servants moved too slowly. How his voice would drop to a menacing whisper when discussing people who had crossed him. The casual way he spoke about dealing with problems that needed to be eliminated. As the wedding day approached, Nazia's dreams of teaching faded completely, replaced by a growing sense of dread that followed her everywhere like a storm cloud. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the whispers about his first wife were true. She had no way of knowing that the answer was hidden in his own pocket, waiting for the most tragic of discoveries. The morning of the wedding arrived with all the chaos and excitement that Pakistani celebrations are famous for. Bright orange marigolds draped every doorway and window, their sweet scent mixing with the smoke from cooking fires where massive pots of biryani and mutton korma simmered. The rhythmic pounding of dal drums echoed through the village streets, calling everyone to witness what they believed would be a blessed union. Nazia sat in her family's small bedroom, surrounded by female relatives who fussed over her appearance with the kind of joy she couldn't share. They layered her in a heavy crimson bridal dress, its gold thread embroidery catching the morning sunlight. Her hands were decorated with intricate henna designs that had taken hours to complete, and her neck was weighted down with borrowed gold jewelry that represented her family's hopes for prosperity. "You look like a queen," her cousin whispered, adjusting Nazia's heavy veil. "Khalid is so lucky to have you." Nazia managed a weak smile, but inside, her stomach churned with anxiety. Every cheerful comment from her relatives felt like another link in the chain that bound her to a future she feared. The ceremony itself was a blur of ritual and celebration. Hundreds of guests filled the small courtyard, eating, laughing, and offering blessings for the couple's future happiness. Children ran between the adults, their faces painted with excitement and hands sticky from sweets. The imam performed the nikah ceremony with solemn dignity, speaking about love, respect, and the sacred bonds of marriage. If only he knew what kind of man he was binding her to. During the reception, Khalid played the part of the gracious groom perfectly. He smiled for photos, accepted congratulations from male relatives, and made all the right responses about his plans for their future together. But Nazia, seated separately with the women as tradition demanded, noticed something that chilled her. The way he looked at her wasn't with love or even affection, but with ownership. As the evening wore on and the celebration reached its peak, Nazia's female relatives began preparing her for the most significant transition of the day. In Pakistani wedding tradition, the bride is taken to her husband's home after the ceremony, where she will begin her new life as a married woman. The preparation was elaborate, her dress was adjusted one final time, her makeup touched up, and her veil arranged to create the perfect image of modest beauty. Her mother, fighting back tears, whispered final pieces of advice about being a good wife and making her family proud. "Remember," her aunt said quietly, "marriage requires patience and understanding. There will be adjustments, but you'll learn to be happy." If only happiness had been possible. The journey to Khalid's house was short but felt like a march toward execution. Nazia rode in a decorated car. Surrounded by singing relatives who had no idea they were delivering her to a nightmare. The streets were lined with neighbors and well-wishers, all celebrating what they believed was a wonderful match. Khalid's house was larger than her family's modest home, with 2 stories and modern conveniences that spoke of his business success. Under different circumstances, Nazia might have been impressed. Instead, all she could think about were the whispers regarding what had happened to his first wife within these same walls. The house was filled with his male relatives and friends, many of whom had clearly been drinking despite the religious prohibition. Their loud laughter and crude jokes about wedding night expectations made Nazia's cheeks burn with embarrassment and fear. As tradition demanded, she was escorted to the bedroom that would now be hers, a room on the upper floor, decorated with rose petals and fancy linens for the occasion. The walls were painted in warm colors, and above the bed hung a ceremonial blade in an ornate sheath, a traditional wedding gift meant to symbolize protection for the new household. None of the celebrating guests could have imagined that this decorative weapon would soon be stained with blood. Left alone in the room, Nazia sat on the edge of the bed, her heavy dress spread around her like a crimson lake. She could hear the continued celebration downstairs, men's voices growing louder with drink, women singing traditional songs, children playing games in the courtyard. Everyone was so happy, so certain that this was a blessed beginning. If you've ever felt completely alone despite being surrounded by people, you'll understand what Nazia experienced in those quiet moments. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you was celebrating something that filled you with dread? Hit that like button if you've ever felt misunderstood or trapped by others' expectations for your life. As the night grew later and the celebration continued below, Nazia had no way of knowing that her worst fears were about to be confirmed in the most shocking way possible. The evidence of Khalid's true nature wasn't hidden in some secret location, it was about to fall right into her hands. The door opened with the sound of drunken laughter. Khalid stumbled into the room, his formal wedding clothes disheveled and his breath heavy with alcohol. His eyes were bloodshot from celebrating, and he moved with the loose confidence of a man who believed he finally had complete control over his newest possession. "My beautiful wife," he slurred, his words carrying a tone that made Nazia's skin crawl. "Did you miss me down there with all the women? I was telling my friends how lucky I am to have such a young, fresh bride." The way he said "fresh" made Nazia want to disappear into the floor. Khalid collapsed into a chair near the window. Fumbling with his pockets as he continued talking about his plans for their marriage, plans that sounded more like threats than promises. He spoke about obedience, about making sure she understood her place, about how much he had paid for the privilege of owning her. That's when it happened. As Khalid shifted in his chair, a folded document slipped from his jacket pocket and fluttered to the floor. In his intoxicated state, he didn't notice, continuing his rambling monologue about what he expected from their union. Nazia's eyes fixed on the paper. Something about it looked official. She could see part of a government seal visible through the fold. Curiosity overcame caution, and she quietly moved closer, pretending to adjust her dress while reaching for the document. What she found changed everything. The document was in Urdu, stamped with the local police department's official seal. At the top, she could see Khalid's name listed as a suspect in an investigation. Her hands trembling, she unfolded it further and began to read the details that would shatter her world. The file detailed witness statements about Khalid's first wife, Fatima. Multiple people had reported seeing her with bruises, hearing screams from their home, and witnessing Khalid dragging her toward his car on the night she disappeared. The investigation had been opened, statements collected, evidence gathered. But then, mysteriously, it had all been dropped. The final page showed the case status as closed due to lack of evidence, but there were handwritten notes in the margins that told a different story. Notes about payments made, witnesses who suddenly changed their statements, and pressure from influential parties to discontinue the investigation. Khalid hadn't just murdered his first wife, he had bought his way out of justice. But the document wasn't the worst discovery. Tucked beneath the police file was a small stack of letters in Khalid's own handwriting. Letters written to someone named Imran, filled with casual bragging about how easy it had been to solve the Fatima problem. One letter, stained with what looked like dried tobacco juice, contained details so horrific that Nazia's vision began to blur. In his own words, Khalid described how he had beaten Fatima unconscious before throwing her body into the Ravi River. He wrote about paying the police investigator to close the case, about threatening witnesses who had seen too much, about how satisfying it felt to finally be free of that disobedient woman. The final letter was dated just 3 weeks before their engagement. In it, Khalid wrote, "I've found my replacement. Young, quiet, and from a poor family who won't ask too many questions. If this one gives me trouble like Fatima did, at least now I know exactly how to handle the problem permanently. The blood drained from Nazia's face as the full horror of her situation became clear. She wasn't just married to a violent man, she was married to a calculated killer who had already planned her potential murder before their engagement was even announced. Khalid was still talking, oblivious to her discovery, rambling about his business success and how fortunate she was to be chosen by someone of his status. His voice seemed to come from very far away as Nazia's mind raced through her impossible options. In rural Pakistan, divorce was nearly unthinkable for women, especially from powerful families. Even if she could somehow escape, her family would never believe her story over his word. They would force her back into his control to preserve their financial arrangement and social standing. She could try to run away, but where would she go with no money, no connections, and no protection? Khalid's business network extended throughout the region, he would find her within days. She could attempt to report him to the police, but the very document in her hands proved that law enforcement was already in his pocket. The same officers who had buried Fatima's case would simply bury her accusations as well. As these realizations crashed over her like waves, something inside Nazia began to change. The terrified, helpless girl who had been forced into this marriage started to burn away, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. She would not end up like Fatima. She would not become another disappeared wife whose murder was covered up by bribes and corruption. If Khalid wanted to play deadly games with innocent women, then tonight he would discover that his new bride was not as helpless as he believed. The letters were still in her hands when Khalid finally stood up, announcing he was going back downstairs for one more drink with his friends. "Don't go anywhere, my dear," he laughed. "I'll be back soon to begin our real celebration." As his footsteps faded down the stairs, Nazia moved to her dowry chest, a wooden box filled with household essentials her family had gathered for her new life. Among the cooking spices, cleaning supplies, and other domestic items was a small packet that most brides receive as a practical necessity, rat poison for dealing with household pests. Her mother had warned her to be careful with it, to keep it away from food preparation areas, to use it only when absolutely necessary. Tonight, it became absolutely necessary. Time became Nazia's enemy and her ally simultaneously. She had perhaps 30 minutes before Khalid returned, 30 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise or joined Fatima at the bottom of the Ravi River. Her hands shook as she stared at the packet of rat poison, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The weight of her situation pressed down on her like the heavy bridal dress that suddenly felt more like a burial shroud. Every choice led to destruction, but at least this way, she might be the one who survived. Working quickly, Nazia moved to the small kitchen area connected to their bedroom suite. Pakistani wedding traditions called for the bride to prepare and serve dud pilai, sweetened milk, to her new husband on their wedding night. It was supposed to be a gesture of care and devotion, a symbol of the nurturing role she would play in their marriage. Tonight, it would become something entirely different. She heated the milk carefully, adding the traditional ingredients, cardamom, almonds, saffron, and sugar. The sweet aroma filled the room, carrying all the promises of a happy marriage that would never come to pass. As the mixture simmered, she watched the golden liquid swirl in the pot and thought about Fatima. Had Khalid's first wife ever prepared this same drink for him? Had she stood in this same kitchen, hoping to build a loving relationship with the man who would eventually murder her? Had she ever suspected what kind of monster she was trying to please? The packet of rat poison felt impossibly light in Nazia's hands, but she knew its contents were potent enough to kill rats within hours. How much would it take to stop a man like Khalid? Too little, and he might survive to finish what he had started. Too much, and the taste might be too obvious, alerting him before he consumed enough. She emptied the entire packet into the milk. As she stirred the deadly mixture, Nazia found herself thinking about her childhood dreams of becoming a teacher. She had wanted to inspire young minds, to help children learn and grow, to make a positive difference in the world. Instead, here she stood, preparing poison for a man who deserved to die but whose death would likely destroy her own life in the process. But what choice did she have? Khalid had made his intentions clear through his own written confessions. She was not his wife, she was his next victim, purchased and delivered by her own family. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made her heart hammer against her ribs. Khalid was returning, and there was no turning back now. She poured the poisoned milk into an ornate glass, part of the wedding gifts, and arranged it on a tray with some sweets. Her reflection in the decorative metal tray showed a young woman in bridal red, but the eyes looking back at her belonged to someone who had aged years in a single evening. The door opened again, and Khalid entered with the confident swagger of a predator returning to his trapped prey. He had clearly consumed more alcohol downstairs, and his mood had grown even more threatening. "There's my dutiful wife," he said, noticing the tray. "Already learning how to serve her husband properly. Good." Fatima took much longer to understand her place. The casual mention of his murdered first wife sent ice through Nazia's veins, but she forced herself to remain calm. She offered him the glass with steady hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "For our new beginning," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Khalid took the glass with a satisfied grin, clearly pleased by what he saw as her submission. "To our new beginning," he agreed, "and to your education in being a proper wife." He drank deeply, draining nearly half the glass in one gulp. The sweetness masked any bitter undertones, and he showed no signs of suspicion. Instead, he continued drinking while regaling her with stories about his business success and his plans for their future, plans that made it clear he viewed her as property to be controlled, used, and eventually disposed of when she became inconvenient. "You know," he said, finishing the last of the milk, "you remind me of Fatima when she was young. Same quiet nature, same frightened look. I had to teach her some difficult lessons about respect, but eventually, she learned. Unfortunately, she became too much trouble in the end." He spoke about murder as casually as discussing the weather, confirming every horrific detail Nazia had read in his letters. This wasn't a man wrestling with guilt or haunted by his crimes, this was a predator who had enjoyed killing and was already planning his next victim. Within 20 minutes, the poison began to take effect. It started with Khalid complaining about feeling overheated, loosening his collar and wiping sweat from his forehead. Then came nausea, which he initially dismissed as too much celebration. But as his symptoms intensified, violent stomach cramps, difficulty breathing, profuse sweating, his arrogant confidence transformed into confusion and fear. "Something's wrong," he gasped, doubled over in pain. "Get help, call someone." But Nazia didn't move. She watched with grim satisfaction as the man who had murdered his first wife and planned to murder her experienced the terror that his victims must have felt. "You killed Fatima," she said quietly, her voice steady for the first time that evening. "You planned to kill me too. I found your letters." Khalid's eyes widened with shock and rage, but his body was too racked with poison to do anything about it. He tried to stand, tried to reach for her, but collapsed back onto the bed, his breathing becoming increasingly labored. That should have been the end of it. Nazia should have waited for the poison to finish its work, then called for help and claimed her husband had suddenly taken ill. But fate had other plans. The bedroom door burst open without warning. Khalid's cousin Imran stood in the doorway, his face flushed from celebration and alcohol, a wide grin on his face that quickly dissolved into horror as he took in the scene before him. Khalid was writhing on the bed, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth, his body convulsing as the poison destroyed him from within. "What's happening?" Imran shouted, rushing toward his cousin. "What's wrong with him?" For a moment that felt like an eternity, Nazia froze. Her carefully planned execution was falling apart, and with it, any hope she had of surviving this night. Imran had seen too much, he would piece together what had happened, alert the family, and ensure that she faced the same brutal justice that had been denied to Fatima. Terror and desperation collided in her mind, creating a perfect storm of panic that would transform a calculated poisoning into something far more horrific. Imran dropped to his knees beside the bed, trying to help Khalid, shouting for someone to call a doctor. In his focused attention on his dying cousin, he didn't initially notice Nazia moving behind him, her eyes fixed on the ceremonial blade mounted on the wall above the bed. The weapon had been a wedding gift, meant to symbolize protection for the new household. Its curved blade gleamed in the lamplight, sharp and deadly despite its decorative purpose. In her altered state of mind, it seemed to call to her, a solution to the new problem that Imran's arrival had created. She lifted the blade from its mount with trembling hands, its weight both heavier and lighter than she had expected. Behind her, Imran was still focused on Khalid, trying to prop him up, calling his name, completely unaware of the danger approaching from behind. But as Nazia raised the weapon, something inside her snapped completely. This wasn't just about silencing Imran anymore. This wasn't even just about survival. Every moment of helplessness she had ever experienced, being forced into marriage, having her dreams crushed, discovering that her husband was a killer, crystallized into pure, unstoppable rage. "You knew," she whispered, her voice carrying a quality that made Imran turn around. "You all knew what he was." The cousin's eyes widened as he saw the blade in her hands, saw the transformation in her face from terrified bride to something far more dangerous. "Nazia, put that down," he said carefully, backing away from the bed. "We can get help for Khalid. Everything will be fine." "Fine?" The word came out as a laugh that held no humor. "Like it was fine for Fatima? Like it would have been fine for me when he decided I was too much trouble?" Imran's face went pale as he began to understand the implications of her words. But before he could respond, before he could try to escape or call for help, Nazia struck. What happened next would haunt everyone who heard about it for years to come. The first blow caught Imran in the shoulder as he tried to dodge, sending him stumbling backward. But Nazia didn't stop there. Something primal had been unleashed, something that had been building pressure for 19 years of powerlessness and had finally found its release. She struck again and again, her movements fueled by a fury that seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. Imran's screams mixed with the sounds of the ongoing celebration downstairs, where wedding guests continued dancing and singing, completely oblivious to the carnage taking place above their heads. But Imran wasn't her primary target, he was just an obstacle. When Khalid tried to crawl away from the bed, his body still racked with poison but driven by survival instinct, Nazia turned her full attention to him. The man who had murdered his first wife, who had planned to murder her, who had bought his way out of justice and thought he could continue his killing spree indefinitely. "Please." Khalid gasped, his voice barely audible. I'll leave you alone, divorce, whatever you want. Like you left Fatima alone?" Nazia's voice was steady now, cold and final. "Like you would have left me alone when I became inconvenient?" The ceremonial blade rose and fell with mechanical precision. Each strike was deliberate, purposeful, carrying the weight of every woman who had been silenced by men like Khalid. Nazia wasn't just killing her husband, she was executing justice that the legal system had failed to deliver. The room that had been decorated with rose petals and fine linens for their wedding night became a slaughterhouse. Blood soaked through the ceremonial bedding, dripped onto the stone floor, and splattered across the walls that had been painted in warm, welcoming colors. But Nazia wasn't finished. In her frenzy, she continued striking long after Khalid's movements had stopped, long after any threat he posed had been eliminated. The blade cut deeper and deeper, her rage finding expression in violence that went far beyond what was necessary for survival. And then, in a moment that would define how history remembered this case, she severed his head completely from his body. The decapitation wasn't planned or calculated, it was the final expression of fury from a woman who had been pushed beyond all limits of endurance. When she finally stopped, breathing heavily and covered in blood, Khalid's head lay several feet from his body, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing. The room fell silent except for her labored breathing and the distant sounds of continued celebration from below. Nausea stood motionless, the bloody blade still clutched in her hands, surrounded by carnage that would shock even experienced investigators. She had started the evening as a terrified bride trapped in an impossible situation. She was ending it as something else entirely, a killer whose actions would divide public opinion and spark debates that continue to this day. But in that moment of silence, staring at what she had done, Nausea felt something she hadn't experienced in months: freedom. The man who had planned to murder her was dead. The cousin who might have covered up her death lay motionless on the floor. The cycle of violence that had claimed Fatima had been broken, not by justice or intervention, but by a 19-year-old girl who had decided she would rather become a monster than become a victim. Outside, the wedding celebration continued, guests still dancing and singing in honor of a union that had lasted less than one day. Soon, someone would come looking for the groom. Soon, the screaming would start. And Nausea's old life would be over forever. But for now, in this blood-soaked room, she was finally free. Comment below and tell me, when someone is trapped with no legal options and facing certain death, how far would you go to survive? The silence didn't last long. Imran's wife had been looking for him downstairs, wondering why he hadn't returned from congratulating the groom. When she couldn't find him among the wedding guests, she decided to check the upstairs bedroom. Her cheerful voice calling his name echoed through the hallway as she climbed the stairs, completely unprepared for what awaited her. Her scream shattered the night. Within seconds, the joyful sounds of celebration transformed into chaos. Wedding guests rushed toward the stairs, their festive laughter replaced by shouts of confusion and terror. The first men to reach the bedroom doorway froze in horror, unable to process the carnage before them. Nausea sat motionless on the floor, still wearing her blood-soaked bridal dress, the ceremonial blade lying beside her. She made no attempt to flee or hide the evidence. Instead, she stared straight ahead with an expression of eerie calm, as if she had found some kind of peace in the violence. The room that had been prepared for a wedding night looked like a battlefield. Khalid's decapitated body lay twisted on the bed, his head several feet away, eyes wide open in eternal shock. Imran was crumpled near the window, his body bearing the wounds of someone who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Blood covered every surface, the walls, the floor, the ceremonial linens, even the rose petals that had been scattered for romance. The metallic smell hung heavy in the air, mixing grotesquely with the lingering scent of the celebratory flowers and incense. "Call the police," someone shouted, though many of the male relatives seemed more concerned with protecting family honor than seeking justice. Whispered conversations began immediately about how to handle the situation, how to minimize scandal, how to preserve reputations. But there was no hiding this level of carnage. Within an hour, the small village was overrun with police vehicles, their red and blue lights casting strange shadows across the wedding decorations that still hung from every doorway. Officers who had expected to be dealing with a domestic dispute found themselves face to face with one of the most brutal crime scenes in the region's history. The photographer's flash illuminated details that would later fill newspaper headlines across Pakistan: the severed head, the blood-soaked bridal dress, the ceremonial weapon, and most haunting of all, the expression of complete detachment on Nausea's face. She answered their initial questions with a clarity that surprised everyone present. Yes, she had killed them both. Yes, she had used the blade. No, she wasn't sorry. When asked why, she simply said, "He murdered his first wife. He planned to murder me. I chose to survive." The police found Khalid's pocket, still containing the documents that had triggered everything, the police file about Fatima's death and his own handwritten confessions. The evidence that proved Nausea's claims about his violent past was literally soaked in his blood. But justice wasn't that simple. Within hours, media vans began arriving from major cities, their satellite dishes and bright lights transforming the quiet rural village into a circus of sensationalism. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to speak, gathering quotes that would shape public opinion for years to come. She was always quiet, one neighbor told the cameras. Too quiet. We should have known something was wrong with her. Khalid was a respected businessman, another villager insisted. Yes, there were rumors, but rumors aren't facts. What she did was unforgivable. But other voices began emerging too, particularly from women who had remained silent for decades about their own experiences with violent husbands. Maybe she did what needed to be done, whispered an elderly woman who had survived her own abusive marriage. Maybe someone finally said, enough. The story spread across Pakistan's media landscape like wildfire. Television news programs led with footage of the blood-stained bedroom. Newspapers competed for the most sensational headlines: bride becomes butcher, wedding night massacre, the killer in crimson. Social media exploded with debate. Hashtag Justice for Nazia began trending alongside hashtag MonsterBride, creating a digital battlefield where supporters and detractors fought over the meaning of her actions. International media picked up the story within days, framing it as another example of the dangers facing women in traditional societies. CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera all sent crews to cover what they dubbed the wedding night murders. But amid all the media attention and public debate, the legal system still had to determine Nazia's fate. Her arrest was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the crime itself. She offered no resistance, made no dramatic statements, showed no signs of the rage that had driven her to decapitation just hours earlier. The woman who was led away in handcuffs seemed like a completely different person from the blood-soaked bride who had dismembered her husband. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court would later describe her as showing signs of severe trauma, but also noted her clear understanding of her actions and their consequences. She wasn't insane, she was a woman who had made a calculated decision to kill rather than be killed. As her case moved through the legal system, something unexpected began to happen. Other women started coming forward with their own stories about Khalid and men like him. The conspiracy of silence that had protected violent husbands for generations began to crack. But would it be enough to save Nazia from spending the rest of her life in prison? The trial of Nazia Bibi became a national obsession. For 2 years, Pakistan watched as the legal system wrestled with a case that defied easy categorization. Was she a cold-blooded killer who had brutally murdered 2 men? Or was she a victim who had fought back against a system that offered her no protection? The prosecution painted a portrait of calculated evil. They presented the gruesome crime scene photos, Imran's widow's tearful testimony, and testimony from Khalid's business associates who described him as a successful, respected member of the community. They focused relentlessly on the brutality of the decapitation, arguing that no threat could justify such excessive violence. This was not self-defense, the lead prosecutor declared. This was revenge, carried out with a cruelty that shocks the conscience. Nazia Bibi is a dangerous woman who took justice into her own hands and murdered 2 innocent men in the most brutal way possible. But the defense told a very different story. Led by a team of attorneys backed by women's rights organizations, they presented evidence that the prosecution had tried to suppress. The police file about Fatima's death, previously buried through corruption, was finally exposed to public scrutiny. Witnesses who had been too frightened to speak before found the courage to testify about Khalid's pattern of violence. Most damning of all were Khalid's own letters, written in his hand, confessing to Fatima's murder and detailing his plans for Nazia. The defense argued that these documents proved Nazia had acted in genuine fear for her life, facing a threat that the legal system had already failed to address. My client discovered that she had been sold to a killer, her attorney argued. The same police force that failed Fatima, the same courts that allowed Khalid to buy his way out of justice, they all failed Nazia too. When the system offers no protection, people must protect themselves. The case became a lightning rod for broader social issues. Women's rights activists organized rallies outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Self-defense is not murder," and "Justice for all victims." Counter-protesters gathered with their own messages about family honor and traditional values. Religious leaders were divided. Some condemned Nazia's actions as an assault on marriage and family structure. Others pointed to Islamic principles about self-defense and the protection of innocent life. Islam permits defending oneself against unjust aggression, one progressive imam testified during the trial. If this woman truly faced death, then her actions, while tragic, were justified under religious law. International attention intensified the pressure on Pakistan's legal system. Human rights organizations watched closely to see whether a woman who had fought back against domestic violence would receive justice or become another victim of a system that too often failed women. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source: other survivors. 3 women came forward during the trial to describe their own experiences with men in their community, men who had used violence and intimidation to control their wives, confident that social pressure and legal corruption would protect them from consequences. "I lived in terror for 15 years, one woman testified. My husband beat me regularly, threatened to kill me, but everyone told me that was normal marriage. When I saw what Nazia did, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope that maybe we don't have to accept this anymore." But the prosecution fought back by emphasizing the brutality of the killings and arguing that legal channels existed for women facing domestic violence. Even if we accept that Khalid was violent, they argued, that doesn't justify the savage manner in which he was killed. Civilized society requires that we resolve disputes through law, not through midnight executions. The families of the victims presented their own compelling testimony. Khalid's mother, elderly and grief-stricken, spoke about losing her son and the shame that his death had brought upon their family. "Whatever he may have done, he didn't deserve to die like an animal," she said through tears. "Nazia took away not just my son, but my grandson Imran, who was innocent of any wrongdoing." Imran's widow testified about the impact of losing her husband, describing the financial hardship and social stigma she now faced as a young widow. Public opinion remained sharply divided throughout the trial. Polling showed that urban, educated Pakistanis were more likely to view Nazia's actions as justified self-defense, while rural and more traditional communities were more likely to see her as a murderer who had violated fundamental social norms. Social media became a battleground of competing narratives. Hashtags like #NaziaTheMonster and #NaziaTheSurvivor trended simultaneously, with supporters and detractors sharing competing versions of the story. International media coverage generally portrayed Nazia sympathetically, framing her case as an example of the broader struggles facing women in traditional societies. This foreign support, however, sometimes backfired by allowing opponents to characterize her defenders as outsiders trying to impose Western values on Pakistani culture. As the trial dragged on, new evidence continued to emerge. A former police officer came forward to admit that he had been paid to suppress evidence in Fatima's case. A maid who had worked in Khalid's house testified about the abuse she had witnessed. But perhaps most significantly, investigators discovered that Khalid had been quietly investigating other potential wives in nearby villages, young women from poor families who would have been as vulnerable as Nazia. "We found correspondence showing that he was already planning his next marriage," a detective testified. He had identified 3 potential brides, all from families with financial problems, all very young. The pattern suggests that he viewed wives as disposable. The trial's climax came when Nazia finally testified on her own behalf. For the first time since the murders, she spoke at length about her experiences, her discoveries on the wedding night, and her thought process as she made the decision to kill. Her testimony was calm, detailed, and utterly without remorse. "I don't regret saving my own life," she told the packed courtroom. "I regret that I had to become a killer to avoid becoming a victim. But given the same choice again, I would make the same decision." When asked about Imran's death, she showed the first crack in her composure. "He was there," she said quietly. "He saw what was happening. In that moment, I believed he would help cover up my death just like they covered up Fatima's. I was wrong to kill him, but I was not wrong to protect myself." The courtroom was silent as she continued, "Every woman in this room knows the fear I felt. You've all heard the whispers about women who disappear, women who have accidents, women whose husbands find new wives after mysterious tragedies. How many of us are supposed to die quietly so that men like Khalid can continue their hunting?" As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of the decision facing the judges became clear. This wasn't just about determining Nazia's guilt or innocence, it was about deciding what message Pakistan's legal system would send about women's rights, self-defense, and the consequences of systematic failure to protect the vulnerable. The verdict, when it finally came, would satisfy no one completely and please everyone partially. But before we get to that final judgment, take a moment to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like Nazia's matter because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, survival, and the lengths people will go to when the system fails them. The verdict came on a gray morning in March 2019, nearly 2 years after that blood-soaked wedding night. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside to hear the decision that would define how Pakistan's legal system viewed women's rights and self-defense. International journalists filled the press section, ready to broadcast the outcome around the world. Judge Hassan Malik, known for his careful deliberation and respect for legal precedent, read the verdict with the solemnity the case deserved. The court finds Nazia Bibi guilty of manslaughter in the deaths of Khalid Masood and Imran Masood, with significant mitigating circumstances. She is sentenced to 15 years imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 8 years. The decision reflected the court's struggle to balance competing demands for justice. By convicting her of manslaughter rather than murder, the judges acknowledged that her actions were driven by genuine fear rather than malicious intent. But by imposing a substantial prison sentence, they affirmed that vigilante justice couldn't be tolerated, regardless of the circumstances. Neither side was satisfied. Women's rights advocates argued that any prison time for a woman defending herself against a proven killer represented a failure of justice. Traditional voices complained that the sentence was too lenient for such brutal killings. But the verdict's real significance wasn't in the specific punishment, it was in the broader conversations it sparked about systemic problems that had created the conditions for this tragedy. The trial had exposed a network of corruption that allowed violent men to purchase immunity from consequences. 3 police officers were eventually charged with accepting bribes to suppress evidence in domestic violence cases. 2 judges faced disciplinary action for their roles in derailing investigations. More importantly, Nazia's case became a catalyst for legal reforms. Women's rights organizations successfully lobbied for stronger domestic violence laws, better protection for witnesses in abuse cases, and mandatory training for police officers handling family violence reports. The Pakistani parliament passed the Fatima Protection Act in 2020, creating specialized courts for domestic violence cases and establishing safe houses for women fleeing abusive relationships. While implementation remained uneven, the law represented a meaningful step toward providing legal alternatives for women in situations like Nazia's. But the most profound changes occurred in the countless personal conversations sparked by her story. In villages across Pakistan, women began talking more openly about their own experiences with violence and control. Mothers started having different conversations with their daughters about marriage, consent, and their right to refuse unsuitable partners. Some families began rejecting arranged marriages that seemed suspicious or rushed. The Nazia case changed everything in our community, said Dr. Fatima Ahmed, a social worker in rural Punjab. Women who had been silent for decades started speaking up. Men who had used intimidation to control their families realized that the old ways weren't sustainable anymore. However, backlash was inevitable. Traditional leaders condemned what they saw as the erosion of family values and respect for male authority. Some communities doubled down on restrictive practices, arguing that giving women too much freedom led to chaos and violence. 3 years after her conviction, Nazia's case took an unexpected turn. International pressure and continued activism by women's rights groups led to a judicial review of her sentence. In a rare move, the Pakistani Supreme Court commuted her sentence to time served, citing exceptional circumstances and her role in exposing systemic corruption. Nazia walked free in September 2022, after serving just over 5 years in prison. But freedom brought new challenges. Death threats from Khalid's extended family forced her into protective custody. Traditional media portrayed her release as controversial, while social media debates raged about whether she was a hero or a villain. She now lives under an assumed name in a different province, reportedly working as a teacher, the dream she had held onto during those dark days before her arranged marriage. Occasional reports suggest she has become an advocate for women's rights, speaking at private gatherings about legal alternatives to violence. But her story's true legacy isn't in what happened to Nazia personally, it's in the broader questions her case forced Pakistan to confront about justice, protection, and the circumstances that push ordinary people to extraordinary violence. Consider the ripple effects. How many potential victims were saved because Khalid's pattern of violence was finally exposed? How many women found the courage to report abuse because they saw that someone had finally fought back? How many families reconsidered their approach to arranged marriages after seeing where blind tradition could lead? These questions matter because Nazia's story isn't unique. Every year, thousands of women around the world face similar impossible choices when legal systems fail to protect them from violent partners. Most choose to endure rather than resist. Some don't survive long enough to have a choice. The uncomfortable truth is that society often forces people into situations where all available options involve tragedy. When we fail to provide legal protection for the vulnerable, we create conditions where violence becomes a rational response to violence. This doesn't excuse brutality or justify vigilante justice. But it does demand that we examine the systemic failures that create these desperate circumstances in the first place. Nazia's story challenges us to ask difficult questions. What do we owe people who are trapped in situations where the law cannot or will not protect them? How do we balance personal accountability with recognition of systemic failures? When is violence truly the only option for survival? These aren't comfortable questions, and they don't have easy answers. But they're questions we must ask if we want to prevent future tragedies like the one that unfolded in that blood-soaked bedroom in rural Pakistan. The wedding decorations from that night were burned, but the lessons from that tragedy continue to resonate. In courtrooms and legislative chambers, in family discussions and community meetings, Nazia's story continues to challenge assumptions about justice, survival, and the prices people pay when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. Her case reminds us that behind every shocking crime is a human story of choices made under impossible circumstances. Understanding those circumstances doesn't excuse violence, but it might help us build a world where such desperate measures become unnecessary. The next time you hear about a case that seems impossibly brutal or senseless, remember Nazia Bibi. Remember that desperation can transform anyone into someone unrecognizable, and that our first responsibility should be creating systems that protect people before they reach that breaking point. Because in the end, the most important lesson from this tragedy isn't about one woman's choice to kill rather than be killed. It's about our collective responsibility to ensure that such impossible choices become unnecessary. What do you think? When all legal options fail and death seems certain, what would you do to survive? Share this story to keep these important conversations alive, and let me know in the comments what lessons you take from Nazia's tragic tale. Remember to subscribe for more stories that challenge us to think deeper about justice, survival, and the complex moral choices people face when pushed beyond their limits. Until next time, stay safe, and remember. Sometimes the most shocking crimes reveal the most important truths about the world we live in.